Recording has started. Right, okay guys, what we're going to look at today is the last bit for the American West. Once we've done this, we take the American West up to its completion, and then we can start revising the conflict and tension module. So we're going to pay specific attention to the Battle of the Little Bighorn tonight and the events that followed and the destruction of a Native American way of life. But what I want to do to begin with is set the scene. Okay, I'm going to talk about the Indian Wars because the Battle of the Little Bighorn happened because of a decision, a treaty that was made during the Indian Wars. So hopefully you can see the screen that I am sharing. I'm using the visualizer. Sometimes it's a little bit blurry. If you haven't clicked on my picture yet, if you do so, it will make the image full screen, and that should be easier for everybody to see. But we're going to start way back in 1834, before there was even any real migration westwards. The government had already labelled the Indians a problem. Those pesky Indians are going to be a problem. So what the government did, President Jackson, he drew an imaginary line down America. Okay, it was called the Permanent Indian Frontier. It didn't divide America in half. Okay, the line was much closer to the east coast. So the land that the white people had was much smaller than the land that was turned over to the Indians. That's not the whites being generous. The whites felt that all the rich land in America was down the east coast, and the rest of America was the great American desert, according to the government. And the government decided to give that to the Indians, say, hey, look, you stay there, we'll stay here, and we will live side by side. Now, that wasn't actually such a bad policy. If the government kept to their promises, the Indians would be left with a huge area of land to live their own independent lives. So, obviously, as we know, the government did not stick to their promise. And I'm going to move just over to this bit now. And you can see, hopefully, it's not very clear even on my screen, but you might be able to see it says, number 2, 1840 onwards, settlers moved west. Even though the settlers were not meant to break the permanent Indian frontier, they did. They quickly realized, as did the government, that the West wasn't such a desert after all, and it's got a huge amount of wealth to offer. Don says it's gone blurry, so hopefully now, give it a second, it will come into focus. I've used the visualizer before with textbooks during revision sessions, and it's always recorded pretty well without it going blurry. So hopefully it will this time as well. But you never know, do you? Has it gone better yet, Don? Well, that's frustrating, isn't it? Okay, well, I'm going to move off of this pretty quickly, so it's only for a little bit of a recap. All you're missing is it says 1840 onwards, settlers move west. And who were the early settlers? The mountain men, the gold miners, and the Mormons. It's back, excellent. It does take a moment sometimes, it's got a bit of a lag. So we've got those 3 key groups, and the early farmers as well. 3 key groups that go west. What do? They take the land. They devour the timber and the grass. They bring guns and disease and violence. And don't get me wrong, when it was just the mountain men, there were plenty of Indian tribes that were happy to trade with them. But when they saw wave after wave after wave of white people moving across their land, they decided that the time was right to fight back. And the Indians and the whites began to fight much more regularly. They began to clash. Now, it looked like there was going to be an all-out war between the Indian nations and the white settlers. Okay? But that war was avoided with the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Hopefully it hasn't gone blurry. It might have, and hopefully it will come back really quickly. The 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie, where both sides made really amazing promises that they were never likely to keep. An example of that promise was the Indians promised to allow the whites to build military forts, roads, and outposts all across their land. The Indians probably aren't going to allow that to happen. Even if the chief agrees it, doesn't mean that the rest of the tribe has to follow it. And unfortunately, that's what happened. The whites, the government, promised to protect the Indians from all of the persecution that the white settlers might heap upon them. Now, is the government really going to protect the Indians from the whites, bearing in mind the government wants to achieve manifest destiny? Probably not. And the treaty quickly fell apart. One of the big reasons is that the Indian chiefs could not speak for all of their people. And also, when the floodgates had been opened up, it was very difficult to close them again and stop those migrants moving west. So they continue to move west in their thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands. And that leads directly on to the Indian Wars. Little Crow's War was the first one. Now, by 1862, the government was promoting the reservation system. After the Treaty of Fort Laramie, essentially the Treaty of Fort Laramie created the reservation system. It created borders for the Indians to stay upon. It's like this tribe must stay here and that tribe must stay over there, where along the river and the mountains or whatever the area was decided upon. Okay? So the reservation system by 1862 was already in full swing, and Little Crow had agreed to move his people onto a reservation, an area of land which will only be theirs with no white interference. Unfortunately for Little Crow, his people faced starvation on the reservation. They couldn't hunt the buffalo, their crops failed, and the government didn't give them the food allowances which had been promised. Little Crow went on the warpath with his people, killed a lot of whites, and in the end, the government had sent in the army to round them all up. It took 3 months, but in that time, any sympathy that people had for the Native Americans evaporated. Stories were printed in newspapers of how the Native Americans were raping women and nailing children alive to trees. So any white person that would read this, they wouldn't understand why Little Crow had gone on the warpath. They would just feel hatred towards the Indians, and there was more chance they were going to back any harsh government policy towards them. So that leads us on then to the following year. This is Black Kettle's uprising now, Black Kettle's War. Different tribe, it's the Cheyenne this time. It's in 1863, but it was the same problem. Black Kettle had agreed to move his people onto a reservation, but when on the reservation, they faced starvation. So what did Black Kettle do? He took his people off the reservation and they stole food from the whites and the settlers and the government stores. What they did not do is kill anybody. They didn't kill anybody, yet the government and the governor of that region decided to send in the army and hunt Black Kettle down, which Shivington and his men tried to do. Wherever they found Indians, they killed them. And Black Kettle had had enough, and he didn't move his people, but he rode into Camp Robinson with his flag hoisted high up in the air, American flag and a white flag, and said, "We want peace." He was denied that. It was the last thing the Governor Evans wanted with the Indians, and he was ordered back to Sand Creek. And hopefully you remember what followed. What followed was one of the worst massacres against the Indian nations ever committed by the whites, the Sand Creek Massacre. It led the Indians to go back onto the warpath. And once again, any sympathy that the whites had with the Indians evaporated because all they saw was the Indians being violent on the warpath. They didn't know the reasons why the Indians started fighting back. And in the end, the Indians agreed peace at Medicine Lodge, which agreed to the creation of even smaller reservations. Take away their land, you take away their ability to be Indians. And then we move on to the Third Indian War, 1867, Red Cloud's War. This one is slightly different to the other two because this isn't about starvation on the reservation. Red Cloud's territory had been invaded by a huge number of gold miners. They had discovered gold in Red Cloud's territory. And a new trail had opened up, the Bozeman Trail, which thousands of miners were using to take them to the gold fields. Now, Red Cloud was obviously angry about this, and he attacked the miners. The army was sent in to help build wooden forts to protect the miners. Red Cloud ambushed the army, led by Fetterman. It was a Fetterman ambush, and killed all of them, Fetterman and over 100 men. So a massive victory for the Indians, but it was short-lived. The government came crashing down on Red Cloud and forced him to agree peace terms at the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie. Okay, this one in 1868. And this agreed to the creation, it says it down there, although it's incredibly blurry, even on my screen. It says down there, not down there, sorry, down here, it led to the creation of the Great Sioux Reservation. Now, this is significant because this plays a big part in the Battle of the Little Bighorn and the end of the Native American way of life. So we'll come back to the Great Sioux Reservation in a moment. And then lastly, the winter campaigns throughout the winter of 1868 and the following years. The Indians were being punished, that they have been increasingly more violent. The government had been increasingly more violent with the Indians. And by 1868, any Indian tribe that had refused to move on to the reservations were hunted down during the winter months. They were hounded and forced to move camp after camp after camp, because if the army caught up with them, they would murder them all. Now, Indians don't really move that much during the winter months. They're still nomadic, but this was moving on a new scale. And soon starvation set in, disease set in, and the winter campaigns were incredibly effective in forcing the last of the Native Americans onto reservations, but not all of them. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull had so far refused to be moved onto a reservation, and that then leads us now neatly into the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So I'm going to move this away. You've got one of these, okay? Somewhere in your American West folder, you have one of these overview pages. So what we're going to look at now, you also have in your book, because I gave you this as a handout. We glued it down. What you should now be able to see are some key bullet points about why the Battle of the Little Bighorn happened. Hi, Rebecca. We've just done a bit of a recap of the Indian Wars and how they lead on to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. What we're just about to look at now are the reasons for the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And we're moving very close to the end of our story now. So remember what I said after Red Cloud's War? Red Cloud was forced to sign the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the second one, which created the Great Sioux Reservation. One of the stipulations of that agreement was that no white man was to ever go into the Great Sioux Reservation. The government agreed, so the Indians signed it. Yet by 1874, gold had been found in the Black Hills of the Great Indian Reservation. So obviously gold miners had broken that treaty. In fact, Custer himself had led an expedition into the Black Hills trying to find gold. Gold was found and the floodgates opened. Obviously, thousands of miners descended upon the Black Hills to try to get something for nothing. This brought them into conflict with the Indians living on the Great Sioux Reservation and Red Cloud. In 1875, the following year, the government tried to work with the Indians. They suggested that they could buy the Black Hills from the Sioux. Unbeknown that the Black Hills is one of the most sacred areas within that reservation, one of the most sacred areas to all of the Sioux. And the fact that they were offered $6 million meant very little to the Indians because they didn't have currency. They didn't use money. They traded. They knew what money was and they knew its importance by this time, but they still didn't value it. So $6 million meant nothing to them. So they refused. The government acted a bit like a spoilt child now, stamped their feet and said, right, you've got an ultimatum. Get back on your reservation within 60 days, leave the miners alone, or you are going to be declared hostile and we will have war. Now, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull refused to move on to a reservation. Okay, they said no, and they continued to attack any miners that tried to access the Black Hills. As a result of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull's defiance, and them murdering the white gold miners, the army was sent in to deal with them. And that then leads on to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So let me show you a map, which is at the bottom of this. You've got this in your exercise books, those of you who are in my class. So the plan was the Indians had congregated. Yeah, I am sorry. Hopefully it will sort itself out in a second, Dom. I don't know what it does though. The technology is so good. It will buffer in a minute, I'm sure of it. If not, just listen, okay? Because you have got this in your exercise books. So, the Indians had congregated into one of the biggest Indian camps the plains had ever seen. People were drawn to Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse's defiance. It felt like they were making a stand against the whites that have already caused so many problems for the Indians. So the Indians had been drawn to Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, and what followed was the biggest encampment of Indians and warriors the plains had ever seen. Now, the government knew about this, and they're probably rubbing their hands together thinking, brilliant, this is our opportunity to strike a decisive blow to the Native Americans. So the army was sent in to deal with them once and for all. And the army came up with a plan, okay? It was a good plan. It had worked prior. It was a three-pronged approach. Hopefully it's not blurry anymore and you can actually see the map. Terry and Custer were going to advance from the east. General Gibbon was going to advance from the west, and Crook was going to advance from the south. And they were going to catch the Indians in a pincer-type movement, catch them unaware and strike that decisive blow. But the plan ran into difficulties almost immediately when Indian scouts spotted Crook's advance from the south. Before Crook knew it, he was swarmed by Indians and forced into a retreat. Okay, so Crook is taken out of the equation. Custer was ordered to take up Crook's position from the south. His instructions were to follow the Rosebud Creek, around the Wolf Mountains, and wait for everybody to be in position. Now, we know what Custer is like. Custer is a glory hunter. He wanted the glory that would come with destroying the Indians by himself. And as a result, he disobeyed orders and he somewhat rushed into battle. And that is why the Battle of the Little Bighorn was such a disaster. Now, I'm going to show you another textbook now. You have got this in the form of a cartoon in your exercise books. This is what happens. As we whiz through it, and we're going to go through it quickly, I want you to be thinking about mistakes made by Custer. You might be asked, potentially, was Custer to blame for the Battle of the Little Bighorn? You might not be asked this, okay? So don't take what I'm saying as gospel. But just thinking about it as we go through this, what were Custer's mistakes? So off the bat, Custer was offered he was offered an extra 180 men and Gatling guns, the machine guns of the age. Custer refused them because he felt it would slow him down. Why was he worried about being slowed down? Probably because he already had an inkling that he wanted to get there first. Move down to statement 3. It talks about how hard Custer worked his men to try to get them there first. Okay. Number 2, I missed that, sorry. He ignores orders and follows a fresh Indian trail across the Wolf Mountains, and he works his men hard throughout the night to get there first. They cover 12 miles on the first day and then 60 miles in the next 2 days. You're absolutely right, Don. We're going to get to that bit in a minute. Okay, so change of plan. They follow a fresh Indian trail over the Wolf Mountains and then another 10-mile night march. By the time they get to the Little Bighorn Valley, his men are knackered. and he allows them to rest. And like Dom says, he allows them to light fires. And his Indian scouts warned him against this. It might give their position away. In fact, it did. But Custer was so arrogant, he was not worried if the Indians knew he was coming, because the Indians were going to be no match for the might of his 7th Cavalry. So, in the morning, he gets word that it looks like the Indians are packing up and leaving. And he didn't want to miss his opportunity. So he divided his men into 3 and he attacked without really, truly understanding the enemy or even understanding the landscape which he would be fighting on. A terrible, terrible mistake. Do you remember the names of the leaders of the other groups? Custer led one group, and then Captain somebody led another one, and Major somebody led another group. Captain Benteen. Oh, somebody's typing. I've already given you one. Captain Benteen and Major Reno. Well done. Terry is a good guess. Terry gets there after the murder and everything. It's Terry and Gibbon, Ethan, General Terry and General Gibbon that arrive after the massacre. I say massacre, after the Battle of Little Bighorn has already finished. So yes, it's Major Reno and Captain Benteen. And if you look here, Reno went up the valley floor. Benteen went just at the bottom edge of a hillside, and Custer advanced along the top of the hillside, the bluffs, with the intention of encircling the enemy. Okay, now, unfortunately, it did not go to plan. Indian scouts knew that Custer was there. Okay, they knew he was coming, and they engaged Major Reno first, who was advancing along the valley floor, and Reno was forced into a retreat. Benteen later followed, and both were pinned down by wave after wave of attacking Indians. Custer heard all the gunfire, thought his men were doing the business, and he tried to hurry around and encircle the Indians, not knowing that the path he was following led him towards quicksand. Also, Crazy Horse forced Custer to go further up on the hillside, where he was encircled by Crazy Horse and his men, and every single one of them killed. They killed their horses to try to stack them up as a wall, but the Indians said that we rained arrows down on the white men. And they literally did. Fired the arrows into the sky, and it rained arrows down onto the white men, and every single one of them was murdered. We've only got the Indian report to go on for what happened at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, because no white man, none of Custer's men survived it. Benteen and Reno's men were rescued the next day. The Indians had kind of retreated by that point, and they were rescued by Gibbon and Terry. So they lived through it, but nobody saw what happened to Custer. And when they saw Custer and his men massacred in such a horrific way, shock rang out across the nation. So hopefully you picked up a number of Custer's mistakes there. One thing that Custer couldn't actually control, there was some things out of Custer's control, in fact. And I'm going to show you another little bit of paper now with some of those things on it. Okay. We did this in class. You took 2 colours and you coloured in the statements to highlight whether they were mistakes by Custer or things out of Custer's control. Okay. So let's just have a quick look at them. So Custer liked battles and wanted glory. A victory might mean he could become president. He wanted to be president. He'd mentioned it a number of times. He was already a war hero from the Civil War, and he knew that if he could defeat the Indians, he would get glory. Make him a 5-star general maybe one day and president of the United States. So that's definitely Custer to blame, isn't it? We are blaming Custer for that. That was his fault. No one knew how large the Indian force was. Because Custer was attacking him, I'm going to blame Custer for that. If you're launching an attack, you better know how big the enemy was. But you could also argue that was something out of Custer's control. Nobody knew how big the Indian force was. Custer, next one, did not obey orders. He cut across the Wolf Mountains and he did not wait for reinforcements. Definitely one of his mistakes. The Indians had better guns than Custer, something Custer could not control. Custer does not give his men weapons. The army does that, and if the army decides to give the soldiers some crappy weapons, then it does impact their ability to do their job. The Indians had traded with the whites, they'd stolen from the whites, they'd even bought their own guns. They had some of the most up-to-date repeating rifles. Okay, so they had better guns. Already mentioned it, Custer disobeyed orders and cut across the Wolf Mountains. He divided his men into 3 groups, a mistake, looking back, although Custer had had success with this tactic before. Don't worry about the next one, about his messenger not really speaking English. It did cause problems, but it's not one of the reasons for his failure at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The next one is, though, the next one is quite a surprise, something Custer did not expect would happen. Indians had traditionally fought a style of guerrilla warfare. They never engaged the army in a pitched battle in the open plains because they knew they'd get destroyed. So one of their favourite tactics was to hit the army, kill as many of them as they can, and then disappear into the landscape, into the environment. And the Indians were very, very good at that. They often ran away from a battle. This was different. Maybe they saw this as their last opportunity. Maybe they felt confident because they had so many of them, but they did not hit and run. They hit wave after wave after wave. And that's what kept Reno and Benteen pinned down and allowed Crazy Horse to murder Custer and the rest of the 7th Cavalry. So that was something definitely out of Custer's control. Reno and Benteen were said to be weak. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. I don't know. And then last one, he refused extra help, Gatling guns and extra men. Said it would slow him down. So I think the vast majority of those bullet points relate to Custer being at fault, although some definitely let him off the hook. Right? So if you had to do a question on this, it's important you write a balanced answer. It's important that you say, well, look, most of the evidence points towards Custer being at fault. You explain yourself, and then you highlight, well, actually, there is some things that were out of his control. He probably still would have been slaughtered at the Little Bighorn, but there were some things that we cannot blame Custer for, such as the Indians having better guns. So, we've had a look at what happened. We've had a look at whether Custer was to blame or not. What we need to do, lastly, is have a little look at the consequences for the Battle of the Little Bighorn and how the government reacted. Because this was humiliating. It really, really was, to a government that had had so many problems with the Indians in the build-up to this event. So this humiliation was not going to be taken lying down. The government was going to react, and the government was going to solve this Indian problem once, and for all. Now, it's not a case of memorizing every single bullet point here, okay? It's about knowing enough bullet points so when you say that there were severe consequences after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, you can back that statement up. So this is significant. All army reservations, all Indian reservations were put under army control. So no longer could the Indians just live a free and independent life. There was an army outpost on every Indian reservation keeping an eye on them. That's important. Next one. The army numbers grew massively. There was a huge investment. This massacre must never happen again. This Indian problem must be solved. So the government threw the money at it, and more soldiers were recruited than ever before to deal with the Indians if they ever rose up again. The winter campaigns continued because they were so effective, and the killing of the buffalo was significant, really significant. Okay, this is something that you must revise for your mock exam. The destruction of the buffalo. In fact, I'm going to show you a page now from the textbook, so it's recorded. So if you were to ever watch this back, you can read over it again and tie it in with your revision. So what you can see, let me clean it a bit more. Okay. What you can see there, hope it's not too blurry, is somebody stood atop a pile, a mountain of buffalo skulls. That is by one of the trading outposts near the railroad. So the buffalo were taken there and their bones were ground down, their body parts used, not in the same way that the Indians would use them, but they were used for meat, was used for the army. And the skin was an important part, it was an important component of the Industrial Revolution. It made the leather straps that connected machinery and cogs together that ran the machines for the Industrial Revolution. So the buffalo was used by the white, but the destruction of the buffalo wasn't for industry or anything like that. The government decided to destroy the buffalo to force the Indians to live more like the white man. If you take away the Indian way of life, in this case the buffalo, that gave them everything, then it forces the Indians to live more like the white man. So, I'm going to highlight bits. You don't need to write it down now, and it will be uploaded to YouTube, but this is stuff that you will probably need for your mock exam, so it's well worth me pulling your attention to it, okay? So 1840, there were 13 million buffalo on the plains, an estimate, and some estimates definitely vary. By 1885, so this is after the Battle of Little Bighorn, about 10 years after the Battle of Little Bighorn, there were just 200 left. So in 10 years, the government's campaign against the buffalo as a way of forcing the Indians to live more like the white man was hugely successful. The numbers had plummeted. Okay, 1871, they realized that the buffalo hide was important for making leather. That leather fueled the Industrial Revolution. The price of a buffalo shot up. Now they were worth more. So we have even more hunters arriving on the plains to take advantage of this. The railroad helped. Where is it? It's here somewhere. Yeah, the arrival of a railroad helped the hunters to flood onto the plains. It made it easy to get onto the plains. Sometimes the hunters didn't even go outside. They simply hung out of the carriage windows and shot into the herds, killing thousands in one go. Such a sad, sad story. Right. By 1875, the hunters had wiped out the southern buffalo herd, and then the railway arrived in the north, and by 1877, there it is, the buffalo herd in the north was gone. No, actually, I've missed that bit out. Sorry, my apologies, okay? And the defeat of the Sioux in 1877 meant that the northern herd was next because more white hunters flooded the plains. And it says there in 1882, 5,000 hunters and skinners were at work on the northern plains. And by 1885, down at the bottom, the northern herds were gone as well. So the vast majority of the buffalo were now gone by 1885. So could the Indians continue to preserve their old ways of life? I would argue no. The government knew what they were doing after the Battle of Little Bighorn in their attempts to destroy the Indian way of life. We're not going to kill them all, although that is what some people wanted to do. The country was divided after the Battle of Little Bighorn into the exterminators who just wanted to wipe the Indians out. Let's go kill every single one. And the humanitarians that wanted to force the Indians to live more like the whites. So unbelievably, this destruction of a buffalo was following a humanitarian argument that we don't need to kill them all, but if we destroy their way of life, they will then be forced to live like the white man. They will get jobs, they will pay taxes, they will be productive members of the economy. So the destruction of the buffalo herds was an important consequence of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Some of the other things, again, you've got this crazy horse Oh, absolutely. Were evil, Ethan. One was a little bit more evil than the other, but they were both wrong policies. So more consequences. Crazy Horse was murdered and Sitting Bull had to flee. If you take away their leaders, you take away their ability to fight back. Indians were forced onto smaller reservations. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And they were forced to obey the laws of the United States and not their own tribal laws. And we're going to talk about that now. Okay, so let me go back to the textbook. And we look at the final things that the government now did to put that final nail in the coffin of the Indian way of life. The Indians aren't really resisting anymore, but they're not necessarily following the laws of the United States. We need to change that. So one of the things that the government did was to reduce the size of the reservations. This is the Great Sioux Reservation when it was constructed in 1868. This is what it looked like by 1876. So a big chunk has been taken away. And by 1889, it had been divided into 3 rather small sections. If you take away their land, you take away their ability to be Native American. They have such a special connection to the land that if they don't have that land, then their way of life is slowly being eroded. And that's what the government is trying to do with this policy. The next thing that the government did was very political. Okay? For example, on the reservations, the chief would often hand out the rations. The government would give the chief the food and the chief would split that food amongst the tribe. It helps to preserve the authority and power of the chief. The government realized that. So they stopped giving the food rations to the chief and they started to give it to individual families, thus undermining the authority of the chief. They also passed the Dawes General Allotment Act, which divided divided the reservation into 160-acre plots of land, just like the Homestead Act did, 160 acres, and the Indian families were forced to live in one of these areas, in one of these 160 acres. What is the act called? Sorry, it was called the Dawes General Allotment Act. It's in bold in that blue box, which I hope you can see on your screen. Now, this, like I said, it created 168-acre plots. You might think that's lots, but what that does, it destroys the Native American culture. They are used to being nomadic, and they are used to be able to roam wherever they wanted. They did not have one area where they must stay. Well, now each family is given one of these plots, and they must stay on these plots. And the last thing about the Dawes General Allotment Act, and this is the kicker, any land which was left over was then sold off to the whites. So now we have whites and Indians living alongside each other again. The Indian way of life, their attempts to preserve their way of life, is slowly being eroded. Keep going, because I've got a few more things to do. We might overrun by 5 minutes, but not long. So economic attack on the Indian way of life. They were banned from leaving their reservation to hunt buffalo, something which is so important to their way of life. And they were not allowed off of their reservations to fight, to make war with their enemies. And once again, that is an important part of what makes them Indian. Their history of warfare between their neighbors and their enemies, well, now they were not allowed. And remember, there is an army outpost on every reservation to make sure that the Indians are following the rules. Slowly but surely, their way of life is being eroded. Next one, religion was targeted. They were not allowed to practice their old traditional religions. The old feasts and dances and ceremonies were banned. The sun dance, for example, was banned. Something that was so important to their society. It was a way of young boys proving that they were becoming men, that they were becoming warriors within the tribe. They weren't allowed to do that anymore. Very, very sad. And then lastly, just down at the bottom, possibly the saddest of all, the Indian children were targeted. The government realized that the Indians didn't have a written language, which meant if you target the children, you can create a situation where they will forget their traditional way of life. They will forget their stories. They will forget how to make stuff out of buffalo. They will lose the skills that make them Indians, and they will have to be more like the whites. So what you can see here is a picture. This is a group of young Native American boys before they were forced into a white boarding school. 6 weeks later, I think it's 6 weeks, no, 6 months later, this is what the same group of boys look like. They weren't allowed to speak their traditional language or follow their old traditions to make bows and arrows and things like that. They were taught the white man way. And because they didn't have a written language, once they lose those skills, once they lose that knowledge, it can't be replenished without being taught to them again. And the government knew this. If they target a whole generation of children, that generation grow up forgetting what makes them Indian, and then they will not be able to pass it on to their children. Very, very evil way of trying to destroy somebody's culture, somebody's way of life. And then the absolute last thing that we are doing with the Native Americans comes with the ghost dance movement and the massacre at Wounded Knee. Now, by the late 1880s and the early 1890s, the Indians, their resistance had been destroyed. But an Indian holy man called Vivoka had a vision. The vision told him that if the Indians danced the ghost dance, the spirits of their dead ancestors will return to the plains and drive the white man from their homelands, and the buffalo would return. Now, to a group of desperate people, this must have sounded like the answer. They're a spiritual bunch. They believe in stuff like this. You and I, visions, we might not believe in it, but to them, they did. So the ghost dance movement spread rapidly. And the Indian agents on the reservations, remember, the army's on the reservations, they're seeing the ghost dance movement spread from reservation to reservation. To them, it looked like the Indians were preparing for war all over again. And you can understand why the whites were terrified about this. They spent so long fighting the Indians. It looked like the Indian problem had finally been solved. But here are the Indians rising up again, dancing, looking like they are about to go on the warpath. And the Indian agents and the government got scared. So much so they sent in the army and they arrested some of the chief protagonists of the ghost dance movement. And one of the chiefs, one of the leaders of this movement was Chief Bigfoot. And Bigfoot and his followers were arrested and they were taken to an area known as Wounded Knee. When the army tried to disarm Bigfoot and his followers, there was some sort of problem. An argument broke out and a shot was fired. As a result of that shot, the army started to just shoot into the crowd of Indians. And by the time that the firing had stopped, 25 soldiers were dead, 146 Sioux Indians were dead. The Sioux dead consisted of 102 adult men and women, 24 old men, 7 old women, 6 boys between the ages of 5 and 8, and 7 babies under the age of 2. This was a true massacre in every sense. The Indians did not deserve this. They did not attack the army. A gunshot sounded out, and that was enough to make the army think that the Indians were attacking. Maybe they did believe that, maybe not, but the army shot into the crowd and massacred so many. And this massacre marked an end to the Plains War. The Sioux and the other tribes of the Plains, their resistance had been broken. They could no longer stand against the whites. For the good of their families, their children, their babies, they must now listen to what the whites have to say. Otherwise, fear another massacre like at Wounded Knee. And unfortunately, that moment, that event, brought an end to the traditional Native American way of life. We still have Native Americans in America, but they do not live in teepees. They do not hunt buffalo. They might be good on a horse, but they'll probably drive a car. They do not wear animal skins anymore. They look like you and I. They wear the same sort of clothes, which is sad. And all of those changes have been brought about by this progress, desire to develop the nation, manifest destiny. So, year 11s, thank you so much for being involved in that. You are the ones that care, okay? The fact that you have joined this meeting shows me that you care more than the others about your GCSE. Now, I know some of the others are going to watch this on YouTube, and I'm not suggesting for 1 second that you don't care about your GCSEs, but please try to attend as many of these sessions as possible. I will give you lots of advice on what to revise in the upcoming mock exams. So thank you very much. I can see Rebecca, it says that you're typing, but nothing's coming through. Oh, thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, you have a good day as well. I'm going to go home and I've got the house to myself. My girlfriend is down at mum's. She's taken the kids. So home alone, I think Domino's meal deal for one. Look after myself and my feet up on the sofa. Thank you, Savannah. You have a good weekend as well. Yeah, stay safe. Take care, Maria. Take it easy, Dom. Good to see all of you here. Angelina, look after yourself. Bye, Ethan. Take it easy, everybody.